But in that same vein, I think it might be good for us to, or for you to define our terms here. Because I think so much of the problem comes from radically different ideas of what these terms, gender identity, sex versus gender mean. And it's really hard to drill down. So why don't you break it down for us just for the sake of this conversation at the very least?
Yeah, I think I'll try to say it the same way I said in one of Xavier's podcasts with Colin Wright. So I think of sex as the set of biological kind of prototypes that allows for effective reproduction, right? So that's hormone profiles, that's testes, and all these kinds of things, the secondary sex characteristics, primary sex characteristics, all these things. And so generally speaking, there's a pretty strong correlation between one's sex and one's gender, right? And so gender being more in a more modern time, at least, the way I described it on the podcast with Colin and Xavier was it's kind of like the personality trait variant of sex, essentially. So it's kind of like what you would think of as temperamental expressions of your sex based upon how you're physically built, right?
Gotcha.
So I think of it no differently. I think of gender no differently than like trait openness or trait conscientiousness or whatever it is. And as we all know, or I think most psychologists know, most psychological traits are fairly heritable if they're pretty pronounced baseline traits like personality traits like, openness and conscientiousness. However, that heritability doesn't even get close to like 50% of the variance, even if you'd like smush them together. So that's not everything. Traits have to be expressed somehow. Right. There's developmental trajectories that differ among people, et cetera. But generally speaking, I think of so-called gender identity as this temperament-like experience of your sex.
And in that podcast that you were referring to, one of the debates that you had with Colin, which I find really interesting, was about this concept of being born in the wrong body. And Colin's take on it was that there was no such thing as being born in the wrong body, as that's actually based on stereotypes. And you disagreed with that. Can you expound on your position and why you disagree with it?
Yeah. So there's this fascinating line of research that people argue over, right? And I think I'm in a smaller camp at this point, just based on my clinical experience, right? So the phrase born in the wrong body is a very philosophically messy phrase. And so let me just say that up front, that I'm not here to debate like the philosophical ramifications of what that means. Like, is yourself separate from who you physically are, right? I don't have the wherewithal mentally to do that. All I'm going to say is when you look at the data on like brain differences, right? There's a very good case to be made that a person who has a quote unquote male biological sex, but there are certain aberrations or differences in how the brain develops with regard to, let's just say, the process of interoceptive awareness, right? And so let's just say parts of your parietal cortex and other parts of your brain have an androgen sensitivity or an androgen insensitivity that's not typical for most males or typical for most females, right? What I'm imagining based upon it's very limited, but the limited data we have is that there is such a mismatch between various parts, morphological characteristics of the brain, right? Like gross densities of different types of neurons, white matter, and then also the expression of various types of receptors for androgens and things like that in the brain, that there's such a mismatch between the physical body and the way the brain develops that it feels as if you're embodied one way, but then your temperamental sense of self is somewhat at odds with how your physical body looks. So that's the only case I'm trying to make. And I think it's a spectrum. I don't think it's a dichotomous, you're this or you're that kind of thing. I think it's, you survey 1,000 trans persons' brains, and you would see different densities of different types of receptors pre and post transition and all these kinds of things. But I would be willing to bet, based upon my clinical experience, that pre-transition, pre-hormones, there were already substantial differences in androgen sensitivity and things like that go way beyond the typical gender nonconforming experience and what that brain might look like. So that's the only thing I was trying to say. I doubt I said it effectively, but that's what I was trying to say.